If you look at Chinese history, China has been divided and reunified multiple times in history, but now external forces seek to make the current division permanent for their geopolitical interests.
Hello and welcome to the Global Majority for Peace podcast. My name is Fiona Edwards and my co-host is Ileana Chan. We're bringing you this podcast every fortnight. What we do is we discuss with special guests from across the world our mission, which is to build a global movement against the US-led war drive against China, Russia, and countries in the global south. Before we get into it with our very special guest today, just wanted to say, if you like what you hear and you support our work, please do subscribe to this channel below. Please like it. Please leave a comment. This way, you'll be ensured to get a notification when we release new episodes. If you appreciate our work and you want to support us more, then please consider becoming a member of Empire Watch on Patreon. The link is in the description of this episode. Your support is vital to building this movement.
Hi, everyone. We are so excited today that joining the Global Majority for Peace podcast is Xiangyu. Xiangyu is an anti-imperialist rapper and political commentator based in Taiwan, China. He is the host of Strait Talk, a YouTube show and podcast, which provides a deep dive into the Taiwan Strait, which he describes as a pivotal battleground between Western hegemony and Eastern resistance. Xiangyu, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me on your new show, which I'm certain will be a flourishing success.
Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Well, we've got brilliant people on it like you, so I hope that there'll be an audience internationally to hear a different narrative, essentially, from what we're hearing on a daily basis, all this barrage against China. So just to start with, though, we wanted to talk to you about your creative work as an anti-imperialist rapper, because obviously the music and the arts play such an important role in inspiring people into the struggle, and particularly against the struggle against war, which is what we're sort of here to be engaged in. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about your music, what are the themes of it, and how it fits in within the broader music scene in Taiwan, what the reception is like to your music, what kind of demographics are you reaching with it, and also, most importantly, how can we listen to it?
I would say that making Chinese hip hop was an important part of my development because I joined the underground hip hop scene here in Taiwan as a teenager, making mixtapes, which was how I got to know most of my friends over here in Taiwan today. Now, my music wasn't always political until later. Basically, when I write lyrics, I write about what's on my mind, and at some point, I felt that the things I was studying on my own time needed to be introduced to other people. I think in the words of Julian Assange, I'm paraphrasing, but he said, if lies can start wars, then peace begins with telling the truth. Something along the lines. And I felt that if the information I was getting and reading and studying could reach more people and those people can share it with the people around them, once the critical mass is reached, that's when things can really change. And I saw music as a way of achieving this, not music in and of itself, but one of the tools in my arsenal. And I was very inspired by artists such as Immortal Technique and the UK's Low-Key, which I'm sure you're familiar with. And as far as my themes go, I don't really want to pigeonhole myself, especially now that I'm trying to make music that resonates with more people so I can introduce ideas I want to spread to more people. So I'll give an example of what my new album is looking like so far, and maybe you and the audience can decide what I'm about. So the concept of my new album is awakening and growth on both a personal and societal level. So there's an overall message against nihilism, hedonism, and towards revolutionary optimism, faith in ourselves, and also how we as people are the masters of our destiny collectively. An example of this is there's a song, it's called Why We Fight. It's not out yet, but it's recorded. It's celebrating the successes of the people, covering, of great events like the October Revolution, the Second World War, the founding of New China, the victory over US imperialism by the Chinese People's Volunteers during the Korean War, and that the future is for us to write. And then I have songs where I play characters and tell stories from their perspectives to expose the crimes of US imperialism. Things like that. And one example of such a song is Your So-Called Freedom and Democracy, which was from 2017, in which I write a song from the perspective of an Afghan child who somehow speaks Chinese. And yeah, just juxtaposed with speeches from various US presidents over the decades to show the hypocrisy of the US ruling class, especially when it comes to things like human rights and whatnot. Now, on my upcoming album, and this song's already released, it's called I Don't Believe. And what it does is it compares narratives we're told against things that can be proven, such as, this is a loose translation of the Chinese lyrics. I don't believe President Maduro was a dictator, but I know democracy has been stifled in countless countries by US imperialism. Or I don't believe the media narratives about Xinjiang, but I know there are hundreds of ICE camps. Fun fact, the original lyrics wasn't Maduro, but it was Kim Jong-un, but I decided maybe I'll tone it down a little bit so, people on the fence won't think I'm crazy right off the bat. Needless to say, my music is quite niche, but it got a bit of exposure back in 2018 when my album Bombard the Headquarters was nominated for Best Hip Hop Album by the Golden Indie Music Awards. Now, before, way earlier, like around 2010, 2011, it made waves in the underground just because it was something quite new. What I did was I was inspired by a lot of rappers that were around back then that were really huge at the time. For example, Lil Wayne. And I was putting my twist to the things that I heard and rapping in Chinese. And this was during a time when information about hip hop was much more scarce than it is today in the Sinosphere. So that was kind of how I got my foot in. And then I thought, since my foot's already in, I might as well use this platform that I have to do something a little bit more meaningful. Now, some people find the music that I do now interesting and it sparks curiosity, while other people think I'm crazy and brainwashed, especially after I shot a selfie stick music video in North Korea talking about the hypocrisy of media narratives surrounding the country. The thing about Taiwan's independent music scene is it's quite ideologically captured by the ruling class, and it's made up mostly of people who had a middle class upbringing. And a lot of so-called independent bands receive government grants for making music. So my music fits the broader music scene in Taiwan, I would say, by not fitting. And that's where I carved my little niche. And the funny thing is, you ask what the typical demographic of my audience, people who listen to my music. I write my music with the hopes of influencing the youth in Taiwan, but the last album sold more copies on the mainland than it did in Taiwan, to the point where it sold out. And I gave permission to somebody on the mainland who supports my work to go find a factory, press more CDs, and to sell them on his own and keep the money. I was like, you're doing promotion for me, essentially. In Taiwan, I would say the people who like my music are people who are into hip hop with a message. Whereas on the mainland and abroad, it's people who see eye to eye with me politically and ideologically. As far as where my music can be heard, it can be found on all major streaming platforms, as well as on YouTube. And all of the links are on my website, xiangyu.tw, which is xiangyu.tw. And like I said, I'm working on my upcoming album, which I believe will be far better than any of the material that I have released so far. So you don't have to check out my music now, but I hope you do once it drops.
Amazing. Well, we'll definitely share this information in the show notes. If you are intrigued by what you've just heard, then do click on the link in the show notes.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you for that. So I think I already sort of went into this Taiwan as a hot topic thing. Here in the West, this idea of like Taiwan being part of China is still weirdly controversial, even though 183 countries recognize Taiwan as a province of China, and that actually includes the US and UK. Can you sort of explain a little bit? I mean, we have gone through this with Li Jingjing, a little bit about Taiwan. She did a pretty good and extensive sort of historical placing of Taiwan and China and the Civil War and everything. But can you sort of explain a little bit more about how Taiwan is part of China, in your words?
Okay, this is going to be a very long story. And believe it or not, what I'm about to say is just the tip of the iceberg, because I think a lot of people have this understanding of Taiwan that begins and ends in 1949, which was Chiang Kai-shek got defeated on the mainland, he went to Taiwan, the end. But Taiwan has been a part of Chinese civilization for 400 years. And contact between the two sides has been even more extensive, going back like 1,000 years to all the way up as early as the Song Dynasty. Now I'm going to start my long TED talk. There's many layers of contradictions to delve into, but I'd like to correct the framing just slightly. Currently, 183 countries recognize the People's Republic of China as a legitimate government, and they acknowledge that Taiwan is a part of China. That being said, the remaining countries still do not recognize Taiwan's independence. they recognize the so-called Republic of China. And it's important to understand the difference because even though the Democratic Progressive Party, the incumbent party right now, tries to redefine the situation by saying Taiwan is an independent country whose name is the Republic of China, the so-called Republic of China Constitution, drafted in 1947, tells a different story. And keep in mind, 1947 was before the People's Republic of China was founded. So this was when the ROC was still globally recognized as a legitimate Chinese government whose administrative territory was all of China. Now, let's get into a little bit of law, shall we? Article 4 of the ROC Constitution states, the territory of the Republic of China according to its existing national boundaries shall not be altered except by resolution of the National Assembly. This resolution has never happened. The territories have never been defined. Now, a lot of people will take this as an opportunity to say, oh, well, Taiwan is actually the aggressor because their government still claims all of the mainland. Actually, this needs to be a little bit nuanced because if the government over here were to drop those claims, that would signal to Beijing we're trying to pursue or formalize two China situation. If both governments more or less claim the same territories while administrating different parts of it, it would be one country with two entities vying for the right to be its legitimate representative. Civil war, internal conflict. The thing is, now we have external forces trying to turn it into an international conflict. Now, back to the law. So in 1991, additional articles were passed to the Constitution, and these additional articles were last amended in 2005. Now, there's a preamble to the additional articles, which I will read to you. To meet the requisites of the nation prior to national unification, the following articles of the ROC Constitution are added or amended to the ROC Constitution in accordance with Article 27, Paragraph 1, Item 3, and Article 174, Item 1. Article 11 of the additional articles states, rights and obligations between the people of the Chinese mainland area and those of the free area, and the disposition of other related affairs may be specified by law. This leads us to the act governing relations between the people of the Taiwan area and the mainland area. That's the name of the law. Act governing relations between the people of the Taiwan area and the mainland area, or what we call as short, the Cross-Strait Relations Law, or Cross-Strait Relations Act. Article 2 of this act defines 1. Taiwan area refers to Taiwan, Penghu, Kinmen, and Matsu, and any other area under the effective control of the government. 2. Mainland area refers to the territory of the Republic of China outside the Taiwan area. From this, we can already see that the Constitution is already a One China Constitution. I guess we can call it an alt One China Constitution, even though the people in government today don't agree with this. When it comes to governance and law, it's what's written on paper that matters. And if you want to change things, you have to go through legal processes, and they haven't done so. Number 3 of that same Article 2, people of the Taiwan area refers to the people who have household registrations in the Taiwan area. 4, people of the mainland area refers to the people who have household registrations in the mainland area. So you see, it's kind of a situation where Taipei recognizes that the mainland is outside of its control, but it doesn't recognize the legitimacy of the PRC. And conversely, the PRC recognizes that Taiwan, Penghu, Kinmen, and Matsu are outside of its effective control, but still legally part of the PRC. So from this, according to the ROC laws, and the so-called ROC is the government on Taiwan today, Beijing will call it the Taiwan administration because it cannot recognize the existence of a legitimate ROC, but that's besides the point. According to the ROC laws, Taiwan is not an independent country, but a part of China, even if China is defined different from how Beijing sees it. So that means absolutely 0 countries recognize Taiwan as an independent country because the ones that don't recognize the PRC recognize the so-called ROC. And the so-called ROC, as I've demonstrated, defines Taiwan as Chinese territory. So why does all of this matter? It shows that while China is divided between the mainland and Taiwan, both sides' laws reflect a consensus that China is a single country that ought to be reunified. If you look at Chinese history, China has been divided and reunified multiple times in history, but now external forces seek to make the current division permanent for their geopolitical interests. It is true that the Taiwan area is separately administered from the rest of China. They are separate authorities. So although so-called ROC laws claim the mainland, a so-called ROC visa is not valid there. And similarly, if you get a PRC visa, it's not valid in Taiwan, even though the PRC claims sovereignty over Taiwan. This is where, from the perspective of foreigners who don't want to get into the nitty gritty because it is a complicated matter and it's not like you're going to explain all of this every time you meet somebody. These two sides are functionally two countries as far as travel, trade, communications, etc. go. But in reality, it's one country that's divided as a result of a civil war and remnants of the Civil War, and thus unfinished business within the country. So, I mean, to further illustrate this point, affairs between Taiwan and the mainland are not handled by the ministries of foreign affairs on either side, but by the Taiwan Affairs Office on the mainland and the Mainland Affairs Council in Taiwan. If Taiwan were to declare independence and recognize China as a separate country, then surely relations with the mainland would go through the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, as opposed to the Mainland Affairs Councils now, wouldn't it? I'm going to draw a historical parallel just to show people how Chinese civilization thinks of these things. When the Ming Dynasty overthrew the Yuan Dynasty, so the Yuan Dynasty was the Mongol Empire, the Chinese part of it, remnants of the Yuan continued to exist in what is now Mongolia and parts of Russia. And from their perspective, they saw the Ming as illegitimate usurpers of the Yuan Empire, while the Ming viewed the Yuan remnants as a renegade entity within the Ming Empire. You see, they didn't see themselves as two countries. And fun fact, interestingly, the Yuan remnants existed until after the Ming was overthrown by the Qing. So the Yuan never surrendered to the Ming, but they did surrender to the Qing, so that's where the continuity happens. And to further complicate the issue with Taiwan, though, it was not only separated from the mainland in 1949 following the Communist Party's victory on the mainland, but it's also very important to note that it had already been separated once from the mainland for 50 years as a result of Japanese colonization after China lost the First Sino-Japanese War in 1895. So from 1895 until 1945, Taiwan was a Japanese colony. There were 4 years of nominal reunification following Japan's surrender, but during those 4 years, the KMT was too busy fighting the civil war on the mainland to really integrate the people on Taiwan with the rest of the Chinese state. During that time, the people on Taiwan were left highly taxed, grossly neglected, and the KMT treated the people in Taiwan with great mistrust because they were former colonial subjects of Japan. So we saw things like the mass firings of civil servants because they couldn't be trusted, and then they got replaced with people from the mainland who were less qualified, but they didn't have their loyalties to China doubted. So of course, this was another contradiction that was further exploited by people with ulterior motives. Now, this is where I want to introduce two terms to you in the audience, 本省人 and 外省人. 本省人 means people of this province, and it refers to people whose families arrived to Taiwan roughly before the 20th century. And then there's 外省人. 外省人 means people from other provinces, and it refers to people whose families arrived to Taiwan from the mainland starting in 1945 up until the mid-1950s, with most of them arriving in 1949. The majority of 本省人 originated many generations ago from southern Fujian, especially Quanzhou and Zhangzhou. And there were some, the Hakka people came from Meixian and Guangdong. And there's also the indigenous population. But usually when we speak of 本省人, it's not really focused on the indigenous. When we talk about indigenous, we'll just point them out separately. Now, this is significant because after 1945, especially 1949, you had people from the mainland from all over China, north, south, east, west, speaking different topolecs and dialects, not having a mutually intelligible language until Standard Mandarin was enforced. So, of course, you couple that with the political factors, and there's more room for mutual misunderstandings. Now, this is important because the KMT suspended democracy in 1949 following their retreat, and this meant that elections for the National Assembly were suspended as well. The last time the National Assembly was elected was in 1948 on the mainland. Now, if democracy were in place, then the people elect representatives in the National Assembly who elect the president. However, because democracy was suspended from 1949 until 1991, the National Assembly did not change whatsoever, and because they were elected in 1948 on the mainland, nearly the entire National Assembly was made up of elites from the mainland. They were 外省人. So this created a dynamic where high levels of government were controlled by mainland elites, while lower levels were managed by local Taiwanese, or 本省人. And while all of this was going on, Taiwan separatism did emerge, but as a fringe ideology for a long time. Even at the turn of the century, when Chen Shui-bian, the first DPP leader, was elected, Taiwan separatism was still not too popular. Now, once again, I know a lot of people are wondering, what does this have to do with everything, if anything, but I'll try to make it make sense. Like I said, for the longest time, Taiwan separatism was a very fringe ideology and was not popular until more recently. When Taiwan was a Japanese colony, the landed aristocracy of Taiwan, as well as the emerging capitalist class, occupied privileged positions within the social hierarchy, and the Japanese colonial authorities would govern Taiwan through them. If you think of the Japanese colonial authority as the dawn of a mafia, think of these landed aristocracy people as the capo regimes. So, like if Japan were Tony Soprano, like the landed aristocracy would be like Christopher Moltisanti for Sopranos fans. Now, when Taiwan was returned to China in 1945, given how high levels of government were occupied by elites from the mainland, the local Taiwanese elites felt left out and were bitter that they weren't given their rightful positions of power. And this isn't to say that they didn't remain powerful, but they nonetheless felt sidelined. And on top of all of this, Chiang Kai-shek's power in Taiwan came from the military and US support. So for the first time, he was not beholden to the landed aristocracy like he was on the mainland. And on the mainland, he was driven out by a bunch of angry peasants. So he learned difficult lessons on the mainland, and now he's finally in a position where he could carry out land reform to stabilize his rule, which, as you can imagine, angered a lot of the local elites. Now, some of these people ended up forming what was called the Provisional Government of the Republic of Taiwan, which operated not out of Taiwan, but out of Japan. It's kind of like how the World Uyghur Congress operates in America, and the membership is probably not even majority Uyghur, but a bunch of foreigners. Similar to that, the so-called Provisional Government of the Republic of Taiwan had more Japanese people in it than Taiwanese. So obviously, internal discontent was being used by exterior forces for their own benefit. Now, the provisional government of the Republic of Taiwan was dissolved in the late 1970s, I believe. And after that point, most separatist activities were based in the United States. So you had organizations like FAPA, which I think is the Formosan something public affairs. I forgot what it stands for, but it's one of those like Taiwan separatist activist groups in America. So what we call the Taiwan lobby today in America, it's really funny because there's like the KMT lobby, the people working in Washington lobbying for the KMT dictatorship back in the day. And then there were the FAPA people and the other Taiwanese liberals who were trying to lobby for Taiwan separatism against the KMT. The Taiwan lobby today is kind of like this Frankenstein's monster created from like both of these trends today, which I think a lot of people don't get. So it's quite complicated. Now, I think it's important to know that when the US supported Chiang Kai-shek, it wasn't ideological support. It wasn't motivated by ideology, but rather out of convenience. And even then, the US tried to oust him a few times. When the writing was on the wall that Chiang Kai-shek would lose the mainland, sections of the US ruling class wanted to abandon him. And once he was on Taiwan, the US was definitely not supportive of his government trying to launch a counterattack to regain the mainland because they would provoke instability in the region. So to understand US policy in this region, we need to understand what is called the first island chain, which is a chain of islands beginning in the Aleutian Islands, going through Japan, with Taiwan like right in the middle of the island chain, going down to the South China Sea and back up through Southeast Asia. This island is part of the US's encirclement of the Eurasian continent, and namely to encircle mainland China. If Taiwan were to reunify with the mainland, that means China has unfettered access to the Pacific, rendering the island chain more or less useless for America. So as early as February 1949, even before the PRC was even established, then Secretary of State Dean Acheson sent diplomat Livingston T. Merchant to Taiwan to try to convince the provincial governor Chen Cheng to declare Taiwan an independent country in exchange for millions in US aid. Now, Chen Cheng refused, but it goes to show how the US thought about creating a separate Taiwan Republic for its own geopolitical gains. Then between that time and like the early 1950s, the US bounced ideas around, including giving Taiwan back to Japan. But then the Korean War broke out and the US renewed its support for Chiang Kai-shek. But Chiang Kai-shek had too many ideas of his own, and he always wanted to return to the mainland. And like I said earlier, this would have threatened regional stability and ruined US designs for the region. So, when the US sent the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait, it wasn't only to prevent the communists from coming to Taiwan, it was also to prevent Chiang Kai-shek from launching a counterattack. Now, during this time, for extra insurance, the US began covertly supporting Taiwan separatists as controlled opposition against Chiang Kai-shek, while overtly supporting Chiang Kai-shek against the communists. So people need to know, Taiwan separatism was not always against the Communist Party of China. It was originally against Chiang Kai-shek, and the US used this to its advantage to keep Chiang Kai-shek under its control. Now, these separatists later on, like liberal elements joined, and they were inspired by US liberal democracy. So there was this trend where they were anti-KMT, anti-Chiang Kai-shek, but pro-US. So, yeah. back when the PRC was in a much weaker position than it is today, it could not have done much if an independent Taiwan were declared. So the US tried hard to make it happen, but Chiang Kai-shek, for all of his faults, would not allow that. Now, I want to introduce a concept. It was called the theory of Taiwan's undetermined status, which is what a lot of separatists like to quote to justify Taiwan as an independent country. When the Treaty of San Francisco was signed in 1950, and the Treaty of San Francisco was the treaty that finalized all the peace settlements between the Allies and Japan after World War II. The US purposely left Beijing and Taipei out of the treaty and worded the treaty so that Japan only surrendered Taiwan, but did not mention who Japan surrendered it to. That way, the US could argue that Japan had only surrendered Taiwan and that Taiwan was just being administered by the Chiang Kai-shek clique until final arrangements were made. However, this theory was nullified by the US itself when it concluded the Sino-US Joint Defense Treaty with Chiang Kai-shek in 1954, which defined Taiwan and Penghu, or what they called Formosa and the Pescadores, as territories of the Republic of China. Chiang Kai-shek was not happy because he wanted the territories of the Republic of China to be defined as the entirety of China. But at the very least, there is a signed document, official document, that the US signed in an official capacity that defined Taiwan as ROC territory. And of course, this treaty was nullified when the US established diplomatic ties with Beijing and acknowledged Beijing's stance that the PRC is the sole legitimate government of China and that Taiwan's a part of China. And according to the UN, the PRC is a successor state of the ROC. So what's ROC territory is essentially PRC territory, unless there are further treaties redefining the borders, as we saw with, Mongolia. Outer Mongolia is considered ROC territory, but the PRC finalized the border dispute and recognized Mongolian independence. Now, when the US established diplomatic ties with Beijing, I'm almost done by the way, the US began pursuing a strategy called strategic ambiguity regarding Taiwan, in which it does not challenge the one China policy, but it also says that, our position is we just acknowledge your positions that Taiwan's a part of China. We're not going to fully commit to recognizing that Taiwan is a part of the PRC. Now, at the same time, the US will not outright support Taiwan separatism because it does not want to rock the boat with the mainland. But what it will do is support Taiwan's democracy. So then they'll covertly support these separatists and then have these separatists say that they're fighting for democracy and support democracy. It's kind of like laundering money. You're basically doing the same thing, but you're adding layers to it to obfuscate your true intentions. It's kind of like how back in the day, the US recognized the ROC and acknowledged Taipei's claims that the mainland also belonged to the ROC, but not actively uphold this claim. So when the liberal opposition movement against the KMT kicked off back in late 1970s and throughout the 1980s, the US supported the liberal opposition against the KMT, and this liberal opposition gave birth to the Democratic Progressive Party, or the DPP, which is the party that's incumbent today. There was also a shift in the US because during the Cold War, the US supported strongmen like Chiang Kai-shek and later his son Jiang Jingguo, because these types of strongmen were what was needed to make sure that communists would not take power. But with the waning of the communist threat from the socialist bloc, which was beginning to fall apart, the US preferred liberal governments in its spheres of influence, since people like the Chiangs had too many ideas of their own and did not always align with US interests. And also because supporting democratic governments was a better look for America, not to mention a liberal democracy is much more malleable and easy to influence. So the US supported the liberal developments in Taiwan. And as soon as the ban on opposition parties was lifted in Taiwan in 1987, the Taiwan separatists who operated for decades in exile started pouring back into Taiwan. And the way that these separatists won support in Taiwan was to play on and exacerbate divisions, for example, between 本省人 and 外省人. Because, for the longest time, upper levels of government were dominated by the elites from the mainland. And it was easy to sell to local Taiwanese, or 本省人, that Taiwan ought to be governed by Taiwanese people for the Taiwanese people, and to associate corruption with the mainlanders who arrived in 1949. But if you look at it, the majority of mainlanders who arrived to Taiwan in 1949 came from working class and peasant backgrounds and did not really enjoy privileges in Taiwan. Things actually sucked a lot for them because they were here, they were poor, they faced discrimination, they couldn't go back to the mainland because, martial law. So they were stuck here, a lot of them against their will, and couldn't reunite with their families until 1988. Now, not to mention, the victims of most political executions were actually mainlanders as opposed to local Taiwanese, because mainlanders were more likely to have contact with communists and thus be suspected communists. Today, the separatists will try to frame the victims of martial law as heroes of Taiwan separatism, but no. Most of them were suspected communists. You had this going on, and meanwhile, when Jiang Jingguo, the son of Chiang Kai-shek, died, his successor Li Denghui, who represented the liberal faction of the KMT, began purging the KMT of the Bonapartist faction and began liberalizing Taiwan both economically and politically. In the past, it was impossible to declare an independent Taiwan because Taiwan separatism was, one, a fringe ideology, and two, Chiang Kai-shek opposed it. But today it's impossible because the Chinese mainland is in a position where it could respond. So the US does not outright support separatism. It does not support the creation of an independent Taiwan, but it wants to maintain the status quo while it wants separatist ideas to spread in Taiwan and for a distinct identity to form so that the people do not want reunification. Because by doing this, the US can maintain the division of China without stepping on Beijing's red line of supporting Taiwan separatism while making it increasingly difficult for Beijing to pursue reunification. And we can see this when the US actually intervened in the 2000s and told Chen Shui-bian, the first DPP member to ever be elected the leader of the Taiwan area, to tone down his separatist rhetoric. Another factor having to do with the 本省人外省人 divide is population today is around 15% 外省人. So like there are people whose families arrived from the mainland in 1949. They're the ones with more immediate attachments and emotional attachments to the mainland because, they grow up hearing stories about their parents and grandparents coming from the mainland. Whereas the remaining majority of the population is many generations removed from the mainland. My mother, for example, she's 6 generations removed from the mainland, but her generation still tends to identify as Chinese because they were taught in school from a young age that we're Chinese. So to wrap this up, there are many layers of complicated contradictions in Taiwan society, and there's a ruling elite in the West that's eager to exploit and exacerbate these internal contradictions to further their geopolitical aims, namely to keep Taiwan outside of Beijing's administration. So nothing else really matters to the global elites, despite what they might say. So I know this probably went on for much longer than you expected, but hopefully this will give you a better understanding and let you in a better context to interpret what the media tells you when it talks about the cross-strait affairs.
Thank you so much. That was a real tour de force of history, and I'm sure our listeners are going to be very intrigued by that. And like you say, this isn't something which we hear a lot about. So thank you so much for that. And we're just now we've sort of dealt with the history, sort of dealing with what's happening today and what potentially is history unfolding really in terms of the stakes of what's going on, because we've got the United States and its allies in the global north on a militaristic war drive against China. And there's a lot of discussion, and this is including amongst US military generals, that the international tensions being stoked up by the United States over Taiwan could escalate into a potential hot war. And I just wanted to kind of get your perspective on how real do you think this threat is? And what would you say to people who believe that the US is preparing to defend the freedom of Taiwan as a justification in the mainstream discourse here in the West?
Unless formal Taiwan independence is declared, or if the US reestablishes US military bases on Taiwan, there won't be a hot war. The DPP is also a lot smarter than Ukraine's Zelensky. If war were to break out, the DPP would lose the little support it has left. Remember, although the DPP's Lai Ching-te won the election, it did so with only 40% of the vote. And if we include abstentions, the DPP won with less than 30% of the vote. So why does this matter? Because for Lai Ching-te to declare Taiwan independence, he could go the referendum route. But as you can see, the people don't really support him. Like 70% of the population does not support him. And if we look at the legislature, it's under the control of the opposition, not the DPP. So he cannot go through the legal processes of either abolishing the ROC and establishing a so-called Republic of Taiwan, nor can it redefine the so-called ROC's borders as just the areas directly under Taipei's administration. Now, if war broke out, reunification would be imminent, and the DPP will not have a spot at the negotiation table, which means its political power will come to an immediate end. Now, this is why a lot of more accelerationist mainland Chinese netizens during the election were actually supportive of Lai Ching-te, because you're like, no, we must support the separatists so then they could provoke a war and we could immediately reunify the country. But that's like internet stuff. Like in the real world, I mean, the power play is a lot more calculating, and it's not just a bunch of zealous people on the internet. I think a greater threat by the current leadership with the US behind it is the mismanagement of Taiwan, leading to the cancellation of preferential terms of trade given to Taiwan by the mainland, and a response in kind from the mainland that would decimate Taiwan's economy and standard of living. One example was when Lai Ching-te was inaugurated. He said in his inauguration speech that he hopes China acknowledges the existence of the ROC and that the PRC and the ROC are two separate countries that are not subservient to one another. This is a red line because although it's not Taiwan separatism, it's too China rhetoric, which is a departure from what leaders in the past have said. And of course, after this, the mainland started doing its countermeasures, canceling the remaining preferential terms of trade outlined by the ECFA, the Economic Cooperation Framework Agreement. The mainland has everything going on its side, whether it's economy, its position in the global stage, politically, or militarily. Whereas if we look at Russia in the years leading up to the war, it was gradually being pushed into the corner. But in the case of Beijing, time is on its side. Every year looks better for it. So it's not that desperate to launch a war unless very clearly defined red lines are crossed. Now, if war were to break out, the aid coming from the US would be similar to the type of aid going to Ukraine, which is money, weapons, voices of support, thoughts, and prayers. Now, we have to remember that Taiwan is an island, and all it would take for the mainland to secure the situation would be to block the major ports and bomb all the runways. That would be enough to paralyze the Air Force and choke off Taiwan's access to materials. It's much more difficult to maintain a supply line on an island than it is in a country like Ukraine, which borders countries friendly to the US. And because the UN recognizes the PRC as the sole legitimate government of China and Taiwan as a part of China, the PLA, People's Liberation Army, enforcing a blockade in the water surrounding Taiwan would not be a violation of international law. And I think one would have to be extremely naive to think the US cares about Taiwan in any capacity beyond caring about its geopolitical interests. I mean, you had people like Ramaswamy saying we should defend Taiwan until we can have the chip technology. And once we have the chip technology and it can be manufactured in America, then we should just let Taiwan survive on its own. Now, I don't know if many people know this, but the first country to ever attack Taiwan with a warship was the US in 1867. And the US also supported Japan's attempted invasion of Taiwan in 1874. So to say that the US is ready to defend Taiwan, whatever that means, I think it's quite naive. It's at most willing to defend its interests. And once that's done, anything else is fair game. I'd like to mention how in the Taiwan Relations Act, which is a universal US law that defines the US's relations with the island, inside this law, inside this act, there is no clause obligating the US to defend Taiwan in a war situation. And the way it's worded is, if there are efforts to determine Taiwan's status by non-peaceful means, then there are matters of grave concern. Now, former Illinois Senator Charles H. Percy proposed changing the wording from matters of grave concern to security interests, but his proposal was shot down because if the wording was changed to security interest, then it would commit the US to war with China should cross-strait antagonisms intensify. Senior Pentagon official Edward Ross said, as the lone superpower, our interests are plentiful and our attention short. We cannot help defend you if you cannot defend yourself, which is why I think you'd have to be very naive to believe the US would commit itself to defending the people on Taiwan in the event of war with the Chinese mainland.
You kind of mentioned Ukraine already, but do you find that maybe the Taiwanese public or maybe commentators as well, are they looking at Ukraine as a kind of, this is an example of what not to do? Is that influencing at all what you're saying, the naivete, as you're saying? Are they learning from it?
I think it was a hard lesson learned for a lot of people because after seeing how the US hung the Ukrainian people out to dry and using them as cannon fodder against Russia, although if you were to gauge Taiwan public opinion based on what Western mainstream media tells you, you wouldn't know this, but many people in Taiwan are waking up to the fact that if war breaks out with the mainland over here, the US isn't going to intervene and we're going to be cannon fodder. You know, when I was doing my conscription, I was in substitute service, so I wasn't in the military, but I served at the National Fire Agency's training center in Zhusan Township, Nantou County, which is in central Taiwan. It's a very rural area. And in that rural area, there's a lot of restaurants that sell urn roasted chicken. It's very good, by the way. If you come to Taiwan, you have to try it, which is chicken. It's wood roasted in an urn. So you need a lot of lumber. And there's a lot of lumber in central Taiwan. That's why there's a lot of those restaurants. Anyways, I went to one of those restaurants to pick up urn roasted chicken for new conscripts that had just finished their orientation. The owner started talking to me. He was like, oh, you're from the training center? And I was like, yeah. He's like, are you training to be a fireman? I'm like, no, I'm doing my substitute service there. He's like, oh, So naturally, we talked about conscription here, and he talked about how conscription was changed from 4 months back to 1 year. So for those who don't know, there's universal conscription in Taiwan for all men, but starting in the early 2010s or late 2000s, it got changed from 1 year to 4 months for people born in 1994 and after. But then last year, they changed it back to 1 year for those born in 2005 and after. Now, I was born in 93, so I would have done 1 year regardless. But yeah, he was talking about the change, and he was like, yeah, it seems like the administration here is preparing us for a potential Ukraine situation, and I wouldn't want that. And just to gauge his response, I was curious. I was like, yeah, Zelensky is selling out his people to go die in a war for the US overlords. And he was like, yes. And I'm worried that the administration here would do the same. That's what he said, point blank. And this is in rural Taiwan. I think people have to know, if you go on social media, most voices coming from Taiwan that can directly interact with you in English are far more ideologically captured by the West than people in, say, rural Taiwan. In rural Taiwan, they're watching less Netflix shows and they're watching more mainland dramas just because of cultural affinity. And the way that they think is more traditional. So I think, though, this is a really good thing to point out because, like you said, when you introduced my podcast and how I refer to it as like a pivotal frontline of the battle between Western hegemony and Eastern resistance, I want to add to it and say that it's not only a frontline between Western hegemony and Eastern resistance, but a pivotal frontline between dying unipolarity and rising multipolarity. So there's definitely a link between the cross-strait situations along the Taiwan Strait as well as the situation in Russia and Ukraine. And if we read Zbigniew Brzezinski's book, The Grand Chessboard, he details U.S. strategy in a unipolar world, which is the U.S. ought to keep the Eurasian continent encircled and maintain a U.S.-led world order. And his biggest fear is a China and Russia united not out of ideological conviction or some sort of ideological allyship, but out of shared interests against U.S. hegemony. And that's what we're seeing playing out today. And I think it's also shouldn't come as a surprise that the Maidan coup in 2014 that overthrew the democratically elected Ukrainian government and the Sunflower Movement here in Taiwan, as well as the Umbrella Movement in Hong Kong, all happened in the same year, 2014. And just one of them was targeting Russia and two of them were targeting China. I think people are putting the puzzle pieces together as history unfolds.
Absolutely. And I think, within NATO, there's a lot of discussion at the moment about expanding its focus to the Asia Pacific to target China. We're seeing a number of NATO members sending their warships to the South China Sea and just increasing belligerent rhetoric. All the military budgets are increasing as well. So just wanted to get your take on, why do you think that the United States, Britain, and other countries in the global north are so interested in targeting China? And what is the perception about these attacks within both Taiwan and mainland China as well?
I think this question fits in very well with the previous one. And like I said, Brzezinski's biggest fear was a situation of China and Russia allying out of shared strategic interests. I mean, right now you have a Belt and Road Initiative undermining the Atlanticist empire, and you have a Russia that's supporting the independence of countries like Syria and Iran from Western hegemony. It's the same reason why the US maintains troops in Japan and South Korea. And I think the formidability of China in providing the world with alternative partnerships was likely seen after 2008, when it was apparent that China did not suffer from the global recession caused by Wall Street the same way that the rest of the world did. In fact, China had to bail the US out. That was around the time when the Obama administration with Hillary Clinton as Secretary of State began its pivot to Asia policy. The pivot to Asia policy, I think, was originally named Pivot to China, but they can't be too honest about their intentions now, can they? Now, perception-wise, I think on the mainland, for the most part, in line with my analysis here. While in Taiwan, what's presented by the media here is essentially how Western mainstream media attempts to frame it, since mainstream media here is essentially Western mainstream media translated into Chinese. So as you can imagine, it's framed as the battle between free and open societies against authoritarianism, universal values versus totalitarianism. But you'll find quite a few people here, especially those from less ideologically captured classes, who understand that it's mostly the US causing trouble.
That's good. I find that hopeful. Not to bring this back to myself, but I find that with my mom, she gets a lot of her news from Taiwanese channels. And it's a lot more balanced than what we get in the West. And so it allows her to see through the propaganda, I think, much quicker than we do, I think, here. So yeah, I'm Chinese ethnically. And like a lot of people, that are Chinese ethnically. I have relatives in Taiwan. I have relatives in mainland, Hong Kong, etc. And I find like the divisive rhetoric to be a largely Western strategic construct. Maybe naively, I'm saying that, but US soft power is incredibly influential. So here we are often hearing about how the younger demographic want a separate Taiwanese identity. They don't want to identify themselves as Chinese. For you in Taiwan, what is your insight into this and how does it play out?
The concept of grooming, like, people online like grooming vulnerable people, especially teenagers. If that can be done on an individual level, then ideological grooming can definitely be done on a societal level. And that's what we've really seen in Taiwan. I think this question ties in very well with my answer earlier regarding US designs in this region. When my parents were growing up, people in Taiwan were taught that we're Chinese, and Taiwanese identity wasn't presented as a counter to Chinese identity, but rather a specific local Chinese identity like a Beijing identity or an Anhui identity. Here's the thing though, whether you like it or not, Taiwanese culture is at its core Chinese culture. Like I said earlier, the vast majority of the people here have roots in southern Fujian. So local Taiwanese culture is very similar to local culture of southern Fujian, namely, Zhangzhou and Quanzhou. And of course, there's also the Hakka people who came from Meishan and Guangdong. And there's also an Aboriginal people who make up 2% of the population. But before Han migration to the island, there was no collective Taiwanese identity because the tribal peoples identified solely with their tribes, not with the island. So there wasn't a Taiwanese identity back then either to speak of. And because Chinese culture is the backbone of Taiwanese culture, any attempt to desynthesize is basically a suicide attack. What separatists want to do today is they'll talk about Chinese identity, but then they'll be like, oh yeah, but see, Taiwan's been governed by so many outsiders over the generations. You had the Dutch, you had the Qing, and then you had the Japanese, and you had the Spanish were in northern Taiwan for a little bit, and then you have the Chinese, the KMT. So Taiwanese culture is really an amalgamation of Chinese culture, Dutch culture, Spanish culture, and Japanese culture. And it's like, okay, but when the vast majority of the people over here, how did Taiwan become a part of Chinese civilization? It was because of mass migrations from the mainland over centuries. Culture is defined by people, not by, who just rules your island for a little bit. Parts of the mainland, for example, Shandong was part of the German sphere of influence. Well, people say, Shandong culture is actually not Chinese culture. It's actually a little bit of Chinese culture, but also a bit of German influence. No, it's Chinese culture in the main. And of course, because of this history, you're going to see a little bit of German influence. For example, the famous beer, Qingdao, it was a German brewery that got taken back by China. So yeah, that's the origins of the beer. You think Chinese people really knew how to make beer before Europeans came along? We had wine, but I don't think there was much beer to speak of. So the way I see it is there is an erosion of traditional culture that grounds the people with this land in the name of desensitization and the adoption of so-called universal values and the cosmopolitanism promoted by the leaders of global hegemony that wish to subdue civilizational and national particularities in favor of a universal culture that's compatible with unipolar hegemony. I think we have to remember unipolarity, multipolarity. Multipolarity wishes for all like national cultures, civilizational cultures to thrive on their own accord. There's no such thing as universal values. It would be wrong for China to try to instill Confucian values in Brazil, for example, now wouldn't it? So why should China or Russia or, I don't know, Indonesia, Syria, why should they be expected to adopt the culture of Western liberal democracy? Right? I still remember in the 1990s when the vast majority of the people here in Taiwan self-identified as Chinese. But starting in the 2000s, the education system was changed so that elementary school students were no longer taught that they're Chinese and instead were taught that they're Taiwanese. And Chinese history was still being taught, but it started being taught in a way that implied it was foreign to us. So you have a new generation of confused Taiwanese who were brought up to not view themselves as Chinese. And a lot of these people scoff at their older generation for viewing themselves as Chinese, calling them brainwashed. Now, on the mainland, because of actions of overzealous Red Guards during the Cultural Revolution, many Westerners have this idea that communists on the mainland are actively destroying traditional Chinese culture. But if you look at it today, it can't be further from the truth because right now the preservation of civilizational culture and the advancement of progress are tied to one another in the mainland. You'll often see, I was recently in Chengdu and I was at the park, People's Park, I think that's what it was called, 人民公园. And they had this propaganda exhibition about national security and the different laws, the relevant laws passed. And with them were passages from Chinese literary classics justifying how these values are in line with traditional Chinese values and that it's Chinese tradition in the 21st century. In Taiwan nowadays, thanks to, a bunch of NGOs and Western influence, Chinese culture is seen as outdated and of the past, while Western universal values represent modernity, which is really sad for me to see because culture is living and genuine culture is rooted in the people, rooted in civilization, with it connects the past with the present and the future. And the universal values pushed by Western hegemony, on the other hand, aren't rooted in the masses, but are pushed from top to bottom by civil society institutions, NGOs. Now, I want to take this opportunity to point out to the claim that, which I believe you're referencing, the claim that only 2% of people in Taiwan view themselves as Chinese today. So National Zhengzhi University does a poll annually asking people whether they view themselves as Chinese only, both Chinese and Taiwanese, or Taiwanese only. In the past, the majority of people in Taiwan view themselves as both, similar to how a non-transplant from Shanghai would view himself as both Chinese and Shanghainese. Today, there's more people who view themselves as solely Taiwanese, and solely Chinese has always been a minority, and the number is dwindling because the people who would call themselves solely Chinese in the past are those who haven't established roots in Taiwan, and those people are dying out. I think an example would be Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang Kai-shek lived in Taiwan for a few decades, but he was objectively not Taiwanese, but somebody from Zhejiang. His great-grandchildren are Taiwanese because their family's been here for long enough to have roots and to really adapt to the local culture here. It's kind of like if I move to Shanghai today, I wouldn't be Shanghainese. If I find a wife there and have a child there, and then that child does the same thing, by the time I get to my grandchildren, sure, they'll be Shanghainese, but I won't be. So the figure of those who identify as both and those who identify as solely Chinese, the figure for 2024 is 32.6%. So the 2% thing applies to people who say they're Chinese and not Taiwanese at all. And those people in Taiwan do exist, but they're a dying population. It's quite dishonest to say only 2% of people in Taiwan call themselves Chinese. Now, 32.6% is still a lot lower than before. But like I said, public opinion is pretty malleable. And when you have Western NGOs operating and you have an education system hijacked by separatists, of course these trends will happen, but they're also easily reversed. When Japan colonized Taiwan for 50 years, towards the tail end of their colonization, they actively tried to remold the people on Taiwan into Japanese subjects. But 50 years of Japanese colonization failed to annihilate Chinese culture on the island. So these separatists, they can't do the same thing because, like I said, the backbone of Taiwanese culture is Chinese culture. You can call apple a potato, but it's still an apple. Another thing that this research doesn't tell us is that in Chinese, there are two terms for Chinese people. One is 中国人 and 华人. 中国人 means somebody from China, the country, while 华人 means culturally Chinese. So a Singaporean Chinese is objectively a 华人, but not a 中国人. But both terms, when they're translated into English, are simply Chinese people in English. Now, in this survey that I'm talking about, the choices given to the people being surveyed are 中国人, which means Chinese from China, Taiwan, a person from Taiwan, or both. Now, if you were to ask the people in this survey who say they're solely Taiwanese whether or not they're 华人, the majority of them will still say yes, which means they still identify with Chinese culture, just not China the country, which of course is because of a manipulation. It also goes to show how things like this are a lot more complicated than presented by Western media. And although the majority of people today may not view themselves as politically Chinese, they still view themselves as culturally Chinese. So I think it's wishful thinking, but history will correct the course.
Yeah, that's really great statistical information there. And just to kind of come in on another element of the situation within Taiwan is, what with the United States dedicating so many resources to attempting to manufacture a crisis over the Taiwan Strait and the threat that we've discussed to world peace that these aggressive actions represent, could you tell us more about the strength of the anti-war movement in Taiwan? How much opposition is there within Taiwan to the US's meddling and this intervention?
If we gauge public opinion in Taiwan by what Western media tells us, or what English language social media accounts that work for NED adjacent think tanks tell us, we'll be led to think that the majority of people on Taiwan are on board with whatever decisions the Taiwan administration today makes. But the reality is, although there aren't many people going out and protesting and waving signs against war, the vast majority of the people here do not want war with the mainland because most of us know it would not be winnable and they'd be dying for US interests. I'm not saying that people here are eager to reunify with the mainland, but the vast majority of the people people here prefer maintaining the status quo over Taiwan separatism. The situation now, it's like this. In the 1980s, the politically correct thing to say in Taiwan was, we will reunify China under the three principles of the people, meaning the Republic of China. Like, China will be reunified under the Republic of China. But by the 1980s, most people knew that that was nothing but a pipe dream. But you weren't really supposed to say that publicly. Now, if you say, oh yeah, separatism is never going to happen. If we fight a war, we're going to lose, and the US is just using us for their political gains, people know it, but you're not supposed to say it, if you know what I mean. So I wouldn't really call this an anti-war movement, but on a natural level, people are mostly guided by anti-war sentiments. I said earlier, a lot of people here intuitively understand that a lot of these problems are caused by US meddling and intervention, but different people have different understandings of this intervention. If you ask around, people understand that on a very basic level that the US invaded Afghanistan and Iraq for control over oil, and that it's using Ukrainians as cannon fodder against Russia, and that it's doing all of this while gun violence is on the rise in America. There's a homeless crisis. There's the people in America are grossly neglected. America's very unsafe. But I'd say when it comes to US meddling in Taiwan, most people are numb or indifferent. And among those who are not numb or indifferent, and they're already the minority of the people, there's a greater number of them who view the US as a self-interested ally rather than viewing the US as a problem or enemy. But I think it's important to know that these positive sentiments of the US have to do with multiple factors. One is ideological conditioning through, decades of first anti-communist propaganda and followed by anti-Chinese like separatist propaganda. But also the fact that when Taiwan became wealthy, especially under the Jiang Jingguo era in the 1980s, it did so in a US-led global supply chain in which it carved out its own niche and got rich. So people are going to associate Taiwan's wealth from becoming a third world economy to quite an advanced one with the United States. But the people here in Taiwan are very pragmatic and are not stupid. It's just shifting alliances is complicated. So then it's like, yeah, status quo, but as soon as the US cannot provide the people on Taiwan with improved standards of living and opportunities for the island to get rich, people are going to jump boat very quickly. Interestingly, I don't know if people know this, but actually I did mention it earlier. Like, Chiang Kai-shek's relationship with the US was not one out of ideological affinity, but rather strategic convenience. I mean, he was the best guy at the time to ensure communists would not gain a foothold in Taiwan, and the US would give him aid. And that's the extent of their loyalty to one another. Now, his son and successor, Jiang Jingguo, was also constantly annoyed at having to strike a balance between his own interests and those of the United States. And keep in mind, Jiang Jingguo was educated in the Soviet Union for 12 years. So there's no way he's viewing the United States as simply a friend. The KMT had a Bonapartist wing that was even more extreme. Like, in the 1980s, there was this faction represented by a guy named Hao Bo-chun. That faction was very anti-communist, but it was also very vehemently detested US meddling and CIA intervention. And I don't know if you know this, but back then, against US will, the Taipei authorities tried to develop nukes and were actually very close to doing so until the US shut it down after Jiang Jingguo died. I mean, this was also back in the day when the KMT was willing to send assassins to kill off political enemies in the United States. I think it's important to remember when Chinese communists criticize the KMT, they criticize the KMT for serving US imperialism, and an attack on the KMT is an attack on the US ruling elites. But when the liberal opposition attacks the KMT, I mean, when the liberal opposition movement that birthed the DPP came about, they were less critical of the US than the KMT was, and they look up to the US as a model for liberal democracy. And their gripe with Chiang Kai-shek and his son wasn't that they served US imperialism, but that they were authoritarian rulers who stifled liberal democracy on Taiwan and weren't Taiwanese. So you'll find that people with more critical views of the US meddling and intervention tend to be either older or less ideologically captured people, whereas students in white-collar PMC in Taipei tend to be far less critical. That's a long-winded answer, but hopefully it provides some insight.
Can you give us some recommendations? We do this in every episode, but I think it would be nice to get recommendations that are from Taiwan or maybe the Chinese-speaking world, which is
Right.
everywhere. But you know what I mean? That are different from the normal Western recommendations that we get for people to actually understand what's going on.
Sadly, a lot of information that's available is not available in English, but I will provide a few recommendations. I'll start off with films because I think people tend to be visual learners, and if there's a story with it, it's easier to follow. There's a film, City of Sadness. City of Sadness is about the 228 incident. The 228 incident, I think, is a manifestation of the various contradictions on the island, whether it be between Binsheng and Waisengren, or just a transition period between Japanese rule and KMT rule. And I think it's important because a lot of pro-China Westerners somehow think that the 228 incident was a genocide against Taiwan's indigenous population, even though the indigenous people were hardly involved in that incident. And I think it's important to understand 228 because the DPP likes to use the 228 incident. They call it the 228 massacre. It was a bloody event. It was a sad event in history. It was a tragedy, but the numbers were nowhere near as high as the DPP claims they were. And it wasn't a simple matter of soldiers from the mainland coming to Taiwan and massacring local Taiwanese people. If you look at the death tolls on the number of Binshengren and Waisengren, so local Taiwanese and mainlanders killed were roughly the same. There's also a director's cut of Seryokbale, or I think the English name is Warriors of the Rainbow, to get a glimpse of Taiwan under Japanese rule. Now, that movie is about what is called the Usha incident, which was an indigenous tribe had enough of abuses from the Japanese authorities, so they staged a uprising against the Japanese. In response, the Japanese engaged in chemical warfare against these tribal people. It's history that a lot of people don't really know about. Jet Li's Once Upon a Time in China trilogy is good for understanding, China's resistance against Western imperialism from a more historical context. And as an added bonus, you get to see a lot of good choreography. As far as reading goes, Henry Kissinger's book on China, I think, is a must read to understand the triangular relationship between Beijing, Washington, or Taipei. And I don't care what anybody thinks of Henry Kissinger as an individual. You don't have to like him, but he was a key player in forming the relationships that exist today between these different administrations. So it's important to understand what was going on through his head and his considerations to understand what's going on now. So if you want to understand how Taiwan was integrated into Chinese civilization, there's a book called Lost Colony, The Untold Story of China's First Great Victory Over the West by Tonio Andrade. I'm probably butchering his name, but it's Andrade. And the same author wrote a book called How Taiwan Became Chinese, Dutch, Spanish, and Han Colonization in the 17th Century. And then I suggest The Cultural Cold War by Francis Stoner Saunders to understand how anti-communist leftism became a tool used by the Western ruling class to create controlled opposition against itself, because you're going to find that in the coming years, there's going to be a lot of support for the Taiwan administration and opposition towards Beijing coming from a left perspective. So that's something to watch out for. And lastly, I just want to plug my new podcast, Strait Talk with Xiangyu, for perspectives of Taiwan, mainland China, cross-strait relations, and beyond, not covered by mainstream media.
Amazing. Thank you. What a comprehensive list you've given us. And I grew up with Once Upon a Time in China. So like when you said that, I immediately
Your eyes lit up.
The theme song, it was like immediately in my head.
Yeah. It's a good theme song.
It's a really good theme song. Anyway, so thank you so much for joining us, Xiangyu. That was amazing. A lot of information, a lot of new information for me as well. I'll definitely check out those films. They sound amazing. And thank you everyone for watching. Please like and subscribe. See you next time. Fiona, do you have any parting remarks?
Thanks again for joining us. It's been a really fascinating discussion. I'm definitely going to listen back and take a list of those recommendations as well and add it to my reading list. Thanks so much for joining us. And I definitely would endorse your recommendation that people follow your show as well to find out more about what's happening with Taiwan, US intervention, because I think this is such a hot topic and all we hear is like lies essentially in the mainstream media. And it's really important to avoid, hot war in this situation. And obviously the attitudes of people in the West is a factor in that, and kind of building that anti-war sentiment is crucial.
Right. I'm very honored that you guys invited me onto your show. Thank you a lot for that. And I wish you great success.
Thank you. Hi, everyone.
Bye.